What happens when the world's most broken man adopts its most broken dog? Mark wasn't looking for love, just a way to survive the grief of losing his son. But Brutus, the unadoptable German Shepherd with a history of violence, had other plans. Have you ever been saved by something you thought couldn't love you back? Before we begin, make sure to like this video, subscribe, and comment below where you're watching from. We read every reply. Let's begin. The windshield wipers dragged across the glass, their steady rhythm matching the dull ache in Mark's chest. Rain pelted his old pickup truck as he pulled into the shelter's nearly empty parking lot, gravel crunching beneath the tires. He hadn't planned on coming here today, hadn't planned much of anything since the funeral, but the silence in his house had become unbearable. The walls echoed with memories, and the garage, once filled with laughter and the clatter of tools, stood cold and abandoned. Mark cut the engine and sat for a moment, watching the rain stream down the windshield. His reflection stared back at him. 3 days of stubble, dark circles under his eyes, a fresh grease stain on his worn blue work shirt from the transmission he'd been half-heartedly tinkering with earlier. He hadn't bothered to change. What was the point? The shelter's entrance was marked by a faded sign, the paint peeling at the edges. Second Chance Animal Shelter, it read, the irony not lost on him. He pushed through the heavy glass door, bringing with him the smell of rain and motor oil. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, harsh and unforgiving, making everything look washed out and tired. A young woman, Lena according to her name tag, looked up from the front desk. Her smile was bright, practiced. "Hi there. Welcome to Second Chance. Can I help you find something specific today?" Mark's voice was rough from disuse. "The one no one wants." Lena's smile faltered for just a second. "I'm sorry?" "Whatever dog you can't get rid of," he clarified, shoving his hands into his pockets. "That's the one I want." She studied him for a long moment, her eyes taking in his disheveled appearance, the way he held himself like a man carrying an invisible weight. Maybe that's why she didn't immediately steer him toward the yapping puppies in the front kennels. Instead, she grabbed a ring of keys from her desk. "Follow me," she said finally. They walked past the main adoption floor, where dogs pressed against their kennel doors, tails wagging hopefully. The barks echoed off the concrete walls, a cacophony of desperation and joy. Mark kept his eyes forward, his jaw set. Lena led him through a heavy door marked "Staff Only" and down a quieter hallway. The kennels here were farther apart, most of them empty. She stopped at the very last one. "This is Brutus," she said softly, gesturing to the large German Shepherd huddled in the back corner. The dog didn't move, didn't even look their way. One eye was clouded over with a cataract, and deep scars crisscrossed his face and shoulders. His right back leg was held at an awkward angle, as if it had been broken and never properly healed. A sign on the kennel door read in bold red letters, "Brutus not adoptable. Caution, bites." Lena crossed her arms. "He was rescued from a fighting ring 5 years ago. We've tried working with him, but he doesn't trust people. Won't let anyone touch him. Sometimes growls when approached." She hesitated. "He's not technically available for adoption." Mark studied the dog. Brutus still hadn't acknowledged them, his body tense but eerily still, as if he'd learned that stillness was safer than reaction. His ribs were visible beneath his patchy fur, and his ears stayed flat against his skull. A dog that had given up. Mark recognized the look. "I'll take him." Lena blinked. "Sir, Mr. Just Mark." "Mark," she tried again. "I need to be very clear. Brutus has severe behavioral issues. He's not good with people, and he needs someone with experience handling aggressive dogs. We can show you some other. He'll do fine." Lena opened her mouth to protest, then stopped. She looked at Mark again, really looked at him, and something in his expression must have answered the question she didn't ask. After a long pause, she sighed. "I'll need you to sign some extra waivers." Mark didn't hesitate. He scrawled his name where indicated, barely skimming the forms that absolved the shelter of all responsibility if Brutus decided to take a chunk out of him. When Lena opened Brutus's kennel door, the dog didn't move. "Brutus," she called softly. "Come on, boy." The German Shepherd's ears twitched, but he remained in his corner. Mark didn't speak, didn't try to coax him. He just stood there, patient and silent, until Brutus finally turned his head to look at them with his good eye. The drive home was quiet except for the rain and the wipers. Brutus lay in the passenger footwell, making himself as small as possible. Mark didn't try to pet him or talk to him. He just drove, one hand loose on the steering wheel, while the gray sky wept above them. When they reached the house, Mark parked in the driveway and turned off the engine. He got out, walked around to the passenger side, and opened the door. Brutus didn't move. Mark stood in the rain, water dripping from his hair, and waited. 1 minute passed, then another. Finally, slowly, Brutus uncurled himself from the footwell. He limped out of the truck, each step careful and measured, his body tense as if expecting a blow that never came. The dog followed Mark to the front door, keeping exactly 6 feet between them. Inside, while Mark hung up his wet jacket, Brutus surveyed the house with his good eye. Then, without a sound, he disappeared under the kitchen table, pressing himself against the wall where the shadows were deepest. Mark moved around the kitchen, his movements slow and deliberate. He pulled a container of leftover stew from the fridge, heated it in the microwave, and sat down at the table. The only sound was the scrape of his spoon against the bowl. Every few bites, he glanced at the dark shape under the table. Brutus hadn't moved, but his good eye gleamed in the darkness, watching. Mark didn't try to talk to him or coax him out. He just ate his stew in the quiet house, 2 broken souls sharing the same space, neither ready to bridge the gap between them. Yet. The rain had slowed to a drizzle by the time Mark pulled into the driveway. He cut the engine and sat for a moment, listening to the water drip from the gutters onto the cracked concrete. In the passenger footwell, Brutus remained motionless, curled into himself like a fist. Mark opened his door but didn't rush. He walked around the truck, rainwater soaking through his worn work boots, and opened the passenger side. Brutus didn't move. The dog's ribs rose and fell in quick, shallow breaths, his one good eye fixed on some distant point beyond Mark's shoulder. "Your call," Mark murmured. He stepped back and waited. A full minute passed before Brutus uncurled with painful slowness. His scarred limbs unfolded stiffly, the bad leg dragging slightly as he climbed out. He kept 6 feet between them as they walked to the front door, his nose working the air, taking in the scents of wet grass and oil-stained concrete. Inside, the house smelled of old coffee and sawdust. Brutus froze in the entryway, his muscles coiled tight. Then, like smoke dissipating, he vanished under the kitchen table, pressing himself into the corner where the shadows were deepest. Mark hung up his jacket and moved through his evening routine with quiet precision. The microwave hummed as it reheated yesterday's stew. The spoon clinked against the bowl. He sat at the table, eating slowly, feeling the weight of Brutus's gaze from beneath it. When he finished, Mark left the bowl on the floor near the table, not too close, and walked away. Morning came gray and damp. Mark found Brutus exactly where he'd left him, though the dog's head lifted slightly at his approach. A bowl of kibble sat untouched near the table leg. Mark made coffee, the bitter aroma filling the kitchen. He drank it standing by the window, watching the sunrise paint the puddles in his driveway with streaks of gold. Behind him, he heard the soft crunch of kibble being eaten. The garage door creaked as Mark rolled it up. He didn't call Brutus, didn't coax. He simply left the side door cracked open and went to work on the Ford pickup that had been sitting on blocks for weeks. An hour later, he felt it, the prickle of being watched. Mark didn't turn around, keeping his focus on the carburetor he was cleaning. In his peripheral vision, he saw the shadow in the doorway. Brutus stood just inside the threshold, his body half hidden behind the doorframe, watching with his good eye. Days passed in this quiet dance. Mark worked. Brutus watched. The distance between them shrank by inches. One evening, as Mark wiped grease from his hands, he found himself talking to the empty air. "Ethan would have loved this truck," he said, patting the Ford's fender. 1967 F100. Found it rotting in a field last spring. From his spot near the tool chest, Brutus's ears twitched. "He was 14 when he got the car bug," Mark continued, his voice rough. "Saved up all summer to buy that beat-up Chevy. Worked on it every day after school. His throat tightened around the memory. Ethan grinning under a smear of grease, holding up a rebuilt alternator like a trophy. A soft clink made him turn. Brutus had moved closer, his nails tapping against a wrench left on the floor. The dog froze when Mark looked at him, but didn't retreat. That night, Mark heated 2 bowls of stew. He ate at the table while Brutus ate beneath it, the sound of his chewing the only noise in the house. Progress, Mark thought. Not much, but enough. The next morning he found Brutus waiting by the garage door, his tail giving a single hesitant wag when Mark appeared. It wasn't friendship, not yet, but it was the beginning of something, a quiet understanding between 2 broken creatures learning to trust again. The morning sun filtered through the garage windows as Mark wiped his hands on an oil-stained rag. Brutus lay near the workbench, his chin resting on his paws, watching as he always did. The dog had begun following Mark to the garage each morning, though he still kept a careful distance. Close enough to observe, but not so close as to invite touch. Mark glanced at the German Shepherd. "Getting comfortable, huh?" he murmured, more to himself than the dog. Brutus's ears twitched, but he didn't move. Back in the house, Mark reheated last night's meatloaf. A chunk broke off as he transferred it to his plate, landing on the linoleum with a soft plop. Brutus, who had been lying beneath the table as usual, lifted his head. His nostrils flared, but he didn't move. Mark pretended not to notice. He sat and began eating, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw Brutus's muscles tense. The dog's good eye darted between Mark's face and the fallen food. A full minute passed before Brutus inched forward, his body low to the ground. He moved like a shadow stretching across the floor, slow, silent, ready to retreat at the slightest provocation. When he reached the meat, he stretched his neck with careful precision, snatched the morsel, and immediately withdrew to his corner. Mark hid a smile behind his coffee cup. Progress. That evening, he placed Brutus's food bowl halfway between the table and the dog's usual spot. Brutus watched him with wary eyes but didn't approach until Mark turned his back to wash dishes. The soft clicking of nails on linoleum and the quiet crunch of kibble were the only signs that the boundary between them had shifted slightly. The next morning, Mark found Brutus standing stiffly in the hallway instead of his usual spot under the table. The dog's attention was fixed on a dust-covered cardboard box shoved against the wall. Ethan's tools was scrawled across the side in faded marker. Mark's breath caught in his throat. He hadn't touched that box in 2 years, not since packing up his son's things. The sight of Brutus standing sentinel before it sent an unexpected ache through his chest. Brutus didn't look at him. Instead, the dog lowered himself with deliberate care, his bad leg extending awkwardly, and lay down beside the box. He rested his scarred muzzle on its surface with a quiet sigh, as if he'd found something he'd been searching for. Mark's hands trembled as he crouched opposite the dog. The cardboard was brittle under his fingers as he lifted the flaps. The smell hit him first, oil and metal and the faintest trace of Ethan's cologne, clinging to the tools even after all this time. Inside, everything was exactly as he'd left it, wrenches organized by size, a grease-stained work glove with a hole in the thumb, and on top, carefully folded, Ethan's favorite red bandana, the one he'd always worn when they worked on cars together. Brutus lifted his head slightly as Mark lifted the bandana. The dog's nose twitched, catching the lingering scent. Without thinking, Mark held it out. Brutus sniffed cautiously, then pressed his forehead against the fabric with a quiet whine. Mark's vision blurred. He ran his fingers through Brutus's fur, the first real contact between them, and felt the dog lean into his touch ever so slightly. In the quiet hallway with the morning light creeping across the floor, something unknotted in Mark's chest. It wasn't healing, not yet, but it was a beginning. Brutus shifted closer, his body warm against Mark's side, as they sat together with Ethan's memories between them. The dog's steady breathing and the weight of his head against Mark's thigh felt like an anchor, something solid to hold on to in the storm of grief that had consumed him for so long. Mark wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. "Guess we're figuring this out," he murmured. Brutus's tail thumped once against the floor in quiet agreement. The morning after Brutus had lain beside Ethan's toolbox, Mark woke to find the German Shepherd waiting by the bedroom door. his tail giving a single tentative wag when Mark stirred. It was the first time the dog had initiated contact. "You want to come to work today?" Mark asked, scratching behind Brutus's ears. The dog leaned into the touch, his good eye blinking slowly. Mark dug out an old bandana from his dresser, not Ethan's, but a similar red one, and tied it loosely around Brutus's neck. The dog stood patiently, as if he understood this was some kind of ceremony. The garage smelled of oil and metal, as always when they arrived, but today it felt different. Brutus explored the space with cautious curiosity, sniffing at toolboxes and tires while Mark prepped for the day's work. He spread an old moving blanket near the service counter, Brutus's new spot. The bell over the door jingled as Mrs. Henderson entered for her weekly oil change. She froze when she saw Brutus. "Oh my," she whispered, clutching her purse. "He's friendly," Mark said, though the words felt strange coming from his mouth. Brutus had been many things these past weeks, but friendly hadn't been one of them, until now. Brutus didn't approach, but he didn't hide either. He simply watched from his blanket, his ears pricked forward. Mrs. Henderson relaxed enough to toss him a treat from her purse, which Brutus caught with surprising grace. Word spread quickly through the small town. By noon, half a dozen regulars had stopped by, some genuinely needing work done, others just curious about Mark's new shadow. Brutus accepted their attention with quiet dignity, though he shied away from sudden movements. It was nearly closing time when the blue minivan sputtered into the lot. The woman who stepped out looked exhausted, dark circles under her eyes, her brown hair pulled into a messy bun. A boy of about 10 followed, his noise-canceling headphones covering his ears, his eyes fixed on the ground. "I'm Sophia," the woman said, her voice frayed at the edges. "The brakes are making this awful grinding." Mark nodded, already reaching for his tools. As he worked, he noticed the boy, Noah, edging closer to Brutus's blanket. The dog lifted his head, his ears swiveling forward. Sophia tensed. "Noah doesn't always—" But Noah was already kneeling, his small hands hovering inches from Brutus's scars. The dog didn't move as the boy traced the ridges of healed tissue with feather-light touches, his fingers mapping each wound with clinical precision. Brutus's tail thumped once against the floor. Sophia's hands flew to her mouth. "He's never, not with animals." Mark understood then. He saw the same hollow look in Sophia's eyes that he saw in the mirror every morning, the look of someone barely keeping their head above water. When he finished the brake job, Sophia pulled out a worn wallet. "How much do I—" "Bring him by again," Mark interrupted, nodding toward Noah, who was now leaning against Brutus, his headphones slightly askew. "We're here most days." Sophia's eyes glistened as she helped Noah back into the van. Through the window, Mark saw the boy press his palm against the glass. Brutus, still on his blanket, lifted one paw in response. That night, as Mark turned off the garage lights, he found Brutus waiting by the truck, his bandana slightly crooked from a day of being someone's comfort. Mark adjusted it carefully. "Guess we're not the only broken ones around here," he murmured. Brutus licked his hand once, the first kiss, before climbing into the truck. The drive home was quiet, but the silence between them had changed. It wasn't empty anymore. It was peaceful. The blue minivan became a regular sight at the garage over the following weeks. Every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon, Sophia would pull in with Noah, who would immediately make his way to Brutus's blanket. The boy still rarely spoke, but he'd begun leaving small drawings, crude but heartfelt sketches of Brutus that now decorated the garage walls. Mark watched one afternoon as Noah carefully braided a new red bandana through Brutus's collar, his small fingers working with surprising dexterity. The dog sat perfectly still, his tail sweeping the floor in slow arcs. "Looks like you've got a new uniform," Mark said, nodding at the bandana. Noah didn't respond verbally, but the corner of his mouth twitched, almost a smile. Sophia, who was wiping down the waiting area chairs, caught Mark's eye and mouthed "thank you." That evening, the sky turned an ominous green as Mark closed up the garage. The air felt thick, charged with impending rain. Brutus paced anxiously by the truck, his ears flat against his skull. "Come on, old man," Mark said, holding the door open. "Let's beat the storm home." But the storm beat them instead. The first thunderclap hit when they were halfway home, a deafening crack that shook the truck. Brutus froze, then scrambled frantically across the seat, nearly climbing into Mark's lap. His claws dug into Mark's thighs as another boom rattled the windows. "Easy, easy," Mark soothed, but Brutus was beyond hearing. The dog's entire body trembled, his breath coming in panicked gasps. By the time they reached the house, the German Shepherd was a quaking mess of fur and fear. Inside, Brutus didn't head for his usual spot under the table. Instead, he bolted for the garage, his safe place, and wedged himself beneath the cot Mark kept there. Rain hammered against the metal roof like gunfire. Mark knelt beside the cot, wincing as his bad knee protested. Brutus had pressed himself into the farthest corner, his body curled so tightly he seemed half his normal size. His good eye rolled wildly, showing white all around. Another thunderclap shook the building. Brutus whimpered, a high, broken sound that tore at Mark's heart. Suddenly, he was 12 years old again, watching Ethan, just 6 at the time, cower under his Batman comforter during a summer storm. He remembered how his son's small hands had clutched at him, how he'd whispered, "It's just noise, buddy." "I got you," into Ethan's sweat-damp hair. Without thinking, Mark grabbed his old work jacket from the hook and lay down on the cold concrete beside the cot. He draped the jacket over Brutus like a makeshift tent, creating a den within the garage that had become their sanctuary. "It's just noise," he murmured, repeating the words he'd once said to Ethan. His hand found Brutus's side, feeling the rapid-fire beat of the dog's heart. "I got you." Lightning flashed, illuminating the garage through the high windows. Brutus flinched but didn't retreat further. Mark kept talking, his voice a steady rumble beneath the storm's fury. Stories about Ethan, about the garage, about nothing in particular, just words to anchor them both. Gradually, Brutus's breathing slowed, his trembling subsided to occasional shivers. When Mark shifted to relieve the pressure on his hip, the dog whined softly and pressed closer, his muzzle resting on Mark's forearm. Mark didn't move after that. He lay there as the storm raged outside, as the rain turned from a pounding fury to a gentle patter. Somewhere around midnight, he realized Brutus had fallen asleep, his scarred face relaxed for the first time all evening. Mark should have been uncomfortable. The concrete was hard, his knee ached, and his arm was going numb under Brutus's weight. But for the first time in years, he felt needed. When dawn finally crept through the garage windows, Mark found his hand still resting on Brutus's side, rising and falling with each steady breath. The storm had passed, but something between them had shifted permanently in its wake. Brutus stirred, blinking up at Mark with his good eye. There was no panic in his gaze now, just quiet trust. He licked Mark's fingers once before extricating himself from beneath the cot, his tail wagging slightly as he shook out his fur. Mark groaned as he stood, his back protesting. Brutus nudged his hand with a wet nose, as if checking he was okay. "Come on," Mark said, ruffling the fur behind Brutus's ears. "Let's get some breakfast." As they walked back to the house together, Mark realized the storm hadn't just shaken Brutus. It had shaken something loose in him too. The grief he'd carried for so long hadn't disappeared, but it had made room for something else, something like peace. The months after the storm passed in a comfortable rhythm. Brutus's nightmares faded, though he still pressed close to Mark during thunderstorms, finding solace in the steady rhythm of his breathing. The garage thrived with Sophia helping manage appointments and Noah spending afternoons curled against Brutus while sketching cars in his notebook. But as winter melted into spring, Mark noticed the changes. Brutus took longer to rise in the mornings, his once powerful legs now stiff with arthritis. His muzzle had gone nearly white, and he paused halfway up the garage stairs to catch his breath. One afternoon, while Noah carefully drew at the workbench, Mark watched Brutus struggle to stand from his blanket. The dog's bad leg trembled violently before finally locking into place. That evening, Mark stayed late after closing. He cleared a space by the large window where afternoon sunlight pooled warm and golden on the concrete. From the storage room, he dragged out an old area rug, faded but clean, and layered it with the thickest moving blankets he could find. Noah arrived the next morning with his mother, his arms full of rolled papers. Without a word, he began taping his drawings to the wall above the blankets, every sketch he'd made of Brutus over the months. The German Shepherd watched from his new spot, his tail thumping weakly as Noah worked. When the boy finished, he pulled a piece of cardboard from his backpack. In careful block letters, he'd written, "Brutus's Corner." Mark helped him nail it to the wall, right above where Ethan's toolbox now sat within the dog's reach. Brutus seemed to understand. That afternoon, when Mrs. Henderson brought her customary treat, he didn't rise to greet her, just thumped his tail from his nest of blankets, accepting the offering with gentle dignity. The morning it happened, Mark knew before he even reached the garage. There was a stillness in the air, a quiet absence where normally he'd hear Brutus's nails clicking across the floor to greet him. He found the German Shepherd lying peacefully in his corner, the rise and fall of his chest nearly imperceptible. Noah arrived moments later with Sophia, the boy's sharp eyes immediately seeing what Mark had. Noah didn't cry. He simply knelt beside Brutus and slipped his small hand into Mark's, their fingers intertwining over the dog's graying fur. The vet arrived within the hour, but one look told her all she needed to know. "Shepherd's had a good long run," Dr. Martinez said softly, checking Brutus's pulse, "especially for one with his history." Mark nodded, his throat too tight to speak. From the toolbox, he retrieved Ethan's old bandana, the one Brutus had always nuzzled so carefully. With trembling hands, he draped it over the dog's shoulders, the red fabric stark against the brindle fur. Noah made a small sound in his throat. He reached into his backpack and pulled out a fresh sheet of paper. While Mark and the vet spoke quietly, the boy drew with fierce concentration, his final portrait of Brutus, this time with wings. That night, after everything was done, Mark sat alone in the garage. The corner by the window seemed too empty, the blanket still indented from Brutus's weight. But when he looked up at Noah's drawings, at all the moments frozen in pencil and crayon, the tightness in his chest eased just a little. Brutus had been many things: a fighter, a protector, a friend. But most of all, Mark realized as he ran his fingers over Ethan's bandana, he'd been the bridge that led them all back to living. Outside, the first stars of evening appeared. Somewhere beyond the garage windows, Mark imagined Brutus running free. No scars, no stiff legs, with a boy in a red bandana waiting to greet him. The thought brought not tears, but something like peace. The morning sun filtered through the garage windows, catching dust motes in golden light as Mark ran his fingers along the smooth oak plank. The woodshop had been silent for years, but yesterday he'd cleared away the cobwebs from Ethan's old workbench. Now his knife moved methodically, carving deep grooves into the rich grain. Brutus. Each letter took shape beneath his trembling hands. Below the name, he added the words that had come to him in the quiet hours before dawn. The one who stayed. Noah's shadow fell across the workbench as the boy peered at the plaque. His fingers traced the freshly carved letters, his touch reverent. Without a word, he pulled a charcoal pencil from his pocket and began shading the grooves, making the words stand bold against the wood. Sophia appeared in the doorway, her arms full of clean linens. "The room upstairs is ready," she said softly. "If you're still sure about—" Mark nodded, driving the final screw into the plaque. "Been empty too long." Together they carried Noah's boxes upstairs, to what had once been Ethan's space. The walls still bore faint marks where car posters had hung, the floorboards still creaked in familiar spots. Sophia hesitated at the threshold, but Noah walked straight to the window, pressing his palms against the glass where he could see the entire garage below. Back in Brutus's corner, Mark hung the plaque above the blanket that still held the shape of a large dog. Noah's drawings surrounded it, a gallery of memories in crayon and pencil. Ethan's toolbox remained open nearby, its tools now intermixed with Noah's sketchbooks. The garage door creaked open. Mrs. Henderson entered with a plate of cookies, her eyes immediately finding the memorial wall. "Oh, Mark," she whispered, pressing a wrinkled hand to her mouth. One by one, the townspeople came. Terry from the auto parts store brought a framed photo he'd taken of Brutus sleeping in a sunbeam. The Martinez kids left a hand-painted rock with a paw print. Even old Mr. Peterson, who'd never been fond of dogs, left a dented dog bowl filled with wildflowers. As afternoon faded to evening, Mark found Noah sitting cross-legged in Brutus's corner, carefully polishing each tool from the box. His small hands moved with the same deliberate care Ethan's once had. Sophia brought 2 mugs of coffee, handing one to Mark. They stood together watching Noah work, the quiet punctuated only by the soft clink of metal. Mark sipped his coffee, studying the plaque above them. He thought of all the roads that had led here, to this garage, to this moment, to a scarred dog who had taught him how to love again, to a quiet boy who understood loss in ways no child should. Noah looked up suddenly, holding out a grease-streaked hand. In his palm lay Ethan's favorite wrench, its notched handle gleaming under a fresh coat of oil. Mark's breath caught. He reached out, but instead of taking the tool, he closed Noah's fingers around it. "Keep it safe for me, yeah?" Noah's eyes shone as he nodded solemnly, slipping the wrench into his own toolbox, the one Mark had given him last week. The silence that settled over the garage wasn't the hollow kind that had haunted Mark for years. It was warm, alive, filled with the quiet sounds of a family moving forward together. Mark looked at the plaque one last time before turning out the lights. "Thanks for showing up," he whispered into the twilight. Somewhere beyond the windows, he could have sworn he heard the faintest jingle of a dog tag and the answering echo of a boy's laughter carried on the evening breeze.